Have you ever tried using the process groups that are defined in the project management body of knowledge on your projects? Did you also then struggle to implement these in your project practice? Well, I still see a lot of project managers using these process groups as a basis for defining their project lifecycle. But honestly, I find that very confusing. That is the reason why I don't want to use them as a project lifecycle. And I will explain you why, so stick around. Hello, project managers and project management professionals. My name is Steven and I'm a certified project management professional. For more than 20 years already, I am involved in all kinds of projects ranging from small initiatives to multi-million programs. My projects became highly successful because I learned to translate the PMBOK into best practices. So let's dive into the topic of today on how to use, or better, not to use the process groups that are defined in the PMBOK. Well, the concept of process groups is introduced early in the 6th edition of the PMBOK guide, more specifically in chapter 1 on page 23. There you can read that a process group is a logical grouping of project management processes to achieve specific project objectives. Now, PMI also adds immediately to it that process groups should be seen independently of project phases. This is already a first warning why process groups should not be mingled with the principles of a project lifecycle. But which process groups have been defined then? Well, the PMBOK actually defines 5 very specific process groups. The first one is the initiating process group. It is the logical grouping of project management processes that allow the project manager to organize the work that is needed to define a new project or a new project phase. The management processes belonging to this initiating group are focused on obtaining the formal authorization to start the project or the project phase. The second process group is called planning. It is actually the largest group of the 5, with not less than 24 processes. That indicates already the importance of the planning activity as part of the project management job. The planning process group contains all management processes that contribute to the creation of management plans and strategies. But these processes are also intended to give the project its shape. Just think about processes like collect requirements, define scope, while they actually conceptualize the project. The executing process group is the third one in the row. Executing management processes are those that the project manager uses to get things done. It are the processes that allow us to organize all the work that experts need to undertake to deliver the specific project results and deliverables. Often misunderstood, PMI does not describe the actual processes of development, for example. It only defines how a project manager should organize the project so these development processes can be executed. The fourth process group that is mentioned is the so-called monitoring and controlling process group. Now, this process group contains 12 processes, making it the second largest, not the largest. So we can already conclude that the job of the project manager should be focused on planning, but also on monitoring and controlling. Now, the monitoring and controlling process group lists and explains all the management processes that a project manager can use to monitor the progress of the project and to control, as much as possible, the agreed boundaries of the project. Last but not least, and unfortunately often neglected in practice, the closing process group. It is the collection of processes that helps the project manager to orderly close a project phase or the project itself. The question of today, however, is how do I use these process groups on my projects? And well, the answer is quite simple. I don't. I use the processes contained in these process groups to translate them into practical tasks and activities, which I as a project manager can perform. And I use the list of processes in those process groups as a kind of checklist to identify which processes are important and which are less important for my project. But I don't use the process groups themselves. And that is even quite logic, because process groups do not serve a practical project management purpose. The objective and real value of process groups is to structure the project management discipline, to structure the explanation of what project management really is. It makes them a kind of, well, let's say, structuring way to to facilitate the discussion and facilitate the explanation on the project management theory, and to make that explanation more easy and more insightful. So the process groups are a great value for project management educators, for those writing books on project management, as well as for those that still have to prepare for the PMP exam. It will allow them to bring structure in all that project management knowledge. But on the field, however, the process groups bring, at least for me, not a lot of value. Very regular, and as part of my business, I perform project audits. By the way, every project manager should understand the art of auditing a project. It proves useful to be able to identify where the weaknesses of the project are and what kind of corrective actions could be undertaken to solve those weaknesses. Well, during such audits, I regularly note that there are still quite some project managers that make use of these process groups as a kind of project lifecycle. It seems they didn't saw the word "in" when reading the PMBOK statement that process groups are independent from the project lifecycle. Now, don't understand me wrong. There is nothing and nobody that prevents you to use the process groups as your project lifecycle. As a project manager, in the end, we are free to define our project lifecycles as we want to. But for the sake of the example, let's now assume that we should use the process groups as a best practice as our project lifecycle. Well, then we know we have to start a project, we have to study about that project, we have to create a project deliverable, and once that is created, we have to transfer that project deliverable to the operations. And if all goes well, we have to close the project as well. Well, there are clearly similarities with the process groups. The initiating process group is about starting the project. The planning process group is about conceptualizing, defining the project. Executing is about getting things done, and closing is about, well, closing. So you could argue that your project lifecycle, making use of the process groups, would become something like initiating, planning, executing, and closing. But what about the monitoring and controlling process group? It seems a bit odd to include that into the lifecycle, as into my opinion, you monitor and control throughout the complete project. You would do monitoring and controlling activities in all the phases of the project and in all the phases of the lifecycle. And given that the initiating process group is about all processes needed to start a project, but also to start a project phase, well, then initiating is actually also valid in all project phases. The Project Management Institute claims that project management processes are iterative. Well, when the management processes are iterative, so are the process groups. And that means that all process groups will occur in all phases of your project lifecycle. So it should be clear that if you use the process groups and their terminology, it might become quite confusing. Now, we have been talking about process groups, but perhaps we should take a look at the purpose of project lifecycle to see if there is any connection possible. Is the purpose of a project lifecycle to offer a structure for a field of study like project management? Or is its purpose rather something you can use to structure the timeline of a project? Well, into my opinion, it is the second option, and I'm supported by the PMBOK on that, by the way. It makes the process groups not likely the best solution to use as the phases of a project lifecycle. While getting into project lifecycles would lead us too far in this video. So, perhaps I should make a specific video on the use of project lifecycles later on. But for now, let's conclude that we should no longer use the process groups as phases of our projects. They are simply not designed for that purpose. Now, stay tuned as I will provide you with some insights on how you can use PMI's process groups to your advantage. But don't forget to like this video and to subscribe to the About Project Management channel. It will motivate me to share more practical project management tips and tricks with you. If you want to be notified when new content becomes available, there is no other way than to hit that bell button. And if you have specific questions on this project management topic, or when you have suggestions for another topic or video, well, certainly leave some comments below. Now for the tip I promised you. As already stated, the value for using process groups in project management on the field is quite low. I do use them, however, in the hype of agility. Project management processes, and thus process groups, are, according to PMI, iterative. So when defining my project management approach, which I have to describe in a project management plan, often followed by a presentation to management, steering group, or a project sponsor, Especially in agile environments, I tend to use the process groups. As they are iterative, they make the link with cyclic approaches and cyclic or iterative thinking and reasoning. So to help people in agile organizations understand my project management approach, I will have to talk their language. In this case, I have to talk about iterations, cycles, etc., etc. So the process groups actually offer me that kind of language and structure. Therefore, using those makes that my project stakeholders will understand me better. So it's a great way to structure my project management plan or the presentations to management about my project management approach. Whilst in a traditional linear organized project, I will make use of the PMBOK knowledge areas as my outline or table of contents. In the agile environment, I will organize my table of contents of my project management plan while making use of the PMBOK process groups. Now, to conclude, a small disclaimer. It is better not to use this information to prepare for the exam. Do not worry, the information is correct and in line with PMI's PMBOK. But as the information is practical oriented, sometimes because of terminology and nuances, it might become confusing when preparing for that exam. I'm not here to help you become successful in the PMP exam. I'm here to help you with getting successful projects. Of course, PMI and PMBOK are registered trademarks and copyrighted. You can find all information you want on their website www.pmi.org. I hope you enjoyed these practical tips and tricks on how not to use the process groups as a project lifecycle. If you like what we do, or want to see more, or just have a chat, well, you can always hit some buttons. The like button, but also the subscribe and the bell icons. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you back in one of my other videos. Till then,